So how do node modules really work? Let's take a look at module.exports and require. In order to try this out, to understand it, we're actually going to go back to our simple module. Remember, we had an app.js file and a greet.js file. In greet.js, we create a function using a function expression. So we have this function greet that we can call, and we set that equal to module.exports to make it available outside of our module. Then in app.js, we used require to get that module, and it returned the value module.export. So we then were able to use that function in our app.js file. In order to find out what's really going on, we're going to set a breakpoint here in Visual Studio Code, and we'll go ahead and start debugging this. The nice thing is that require is a JavaScript function, and even though it exists in the JavaScript side of the Node core, we can actually step into it and see the JavaScript that is running as it's running. And this will help us understand what's really going on. All right, so let's take a look. To do this, instead of stepping over the function onto the next line in this file, I'll step into the function. So let's step in, and here we are, inside the JavaScript side of the Node core. I'm in a file called module.js, which is just one of the JavaScript files that's built into Node. And we can see that I'm actually inside the require function. The require function takes a path, which is the string that I pass to it. So if I was to look at this path value over here, we can see that I pass to it ./greet. This require function itself is actually just returning what comes back from the real require function, which I'll step into, which is sitting on the prototype attached to this function constructor module. So in other words, every module you create gets an object created to represent it, and that has access to a require method using prototypal inheritance. So this is the require function, but it's actually just a wrapper for a load function. And here's where we start to see what's happening. First of all, I can see that it's setting up some variables that I can use, like file name. It shows me the full path to the file that I'm trying to access. We'll skip over this native module portion. We'll see that a bit later. And here's the spot where my object is created to represent the module that I'm creating with my JS file. It creates this using the new keyword and this function constructor. So I'll just step over that. And now we have this module object. If we take a quick look at it, we can see that it has a few different properties, and it has this exports object that's actually just an empty object sitting on it. So that's module.exports, this empty exports object that's sitting on my module object that was created particularly for this module I'm trying to load. If I keep going, we'll see eventually we actually get to this part where it now has my module object that's been created, and it's going to actually load the contents of my file, of my JavaScript file. So let's step into that. This is where it actually loads it. And remember we said that it doesn't matter, I can put .js or not. Well, here's where that happens. I can see that it figures out that my extension is .js by basically saying if I don't provide an extension, it will assume that it's a .js file. So if you ever have to require a file other than a .js file, you would have to put the extension, because require, the function, will assume that if you don't put an extension, you mean .js. We can also see that there's this module extensions object, which it's using the syntax that we saw before with objects, where I can actually put brackets and then a string to represent the property that I'm looking for. So we could see that there's this idea that there's a module dot underscore extensions. I could actually put it in this area called watch over here in Visual Studio Code so I can go find it and see what it has. And it actually is an object. And these .js, .json, .node, those are names. Those are property names. Remember, these are name value pairs, objects. So the name is .js and the value is a function. The name is .json and the value is a function. These are the types of files that Node.js will support loading. And it actually has a function. So, in other words, when it knows you want a .js file, it will call this function. And when it knows you want a .json file, it will call this other function. So it calls that function right here. So we'll go ahead and step into it. Notice that it is this object with this property name, an odd property name, .js, but it makes it easy to map the file name. And so we'll just step now into where we're really getting into the nitty-gritty. This is compile. Now it's going to actually compile my code. That is, it's going to actually run it through the V8 engine. It has my file name. It has the contents of my file. If I look at content, there's my var greet equals function, etc. So it now has the contents of my file, and it's going to run it through the V8 engine. I'll step through briefly. It'll process the contents of my file a bit. And then if I step through again, here we're in the compile function. This is also on the prototype, available to all modules. And I'm going to step down now to see when I get to a bit lower. We'll just step down. And we're skipping over quite a number of things. Here's another interesting one that we'll see. Directory name. So this is the path, not to the full file, to the file itself, but the folder the file lives in. So that's available to me later. And then here, create wrapper function, module.wrap. So it takes my JavaScript content and wraps it. Let's stop and think about what this means. Node.js is taking my JavaScript that I've written and passing it to the V8 engine. But what's stopping Node from adding to or changing what I've written? Nothing. It's a program that can do whatever it wants to with the text that I've written, and that's exactly what Node.js does. It doesn't just give V8 the code you've written. It wraps it in some other code that makes all this work. So let's step into that. And we'll see that these are actually some borrowed functions from another area, but it's enough to understand that when we see what's actually happening, this script variable is my code. And it's concatenating, that is, it's taking a string, my script, which is a string, a bunch of JavaScript code I've written, that was pulled from the file, and then putting another string. And the string that it's getting looks to be an array, and it's right here. The first element of the array, and the last element of the array, and then my code is put in between and created as one string, and then given to V8. So the code that I've written is wrapped in a function. What looks kind of like what we saw when we were looking at immediately invoked function expressions. It's being wrapped in a function expression. That means everything I write in Node is actually run in V8, not just by itself, but wrapped inside of this particular function expression. What does that mean? Well, if we keep going, that code is then run, is then executed. We'll skip down a bit. And when that function is invoked on this line, .apply in JavaScript is just another way of invoking a function. This first part says what the this keyword should be, so that's a useful part of apply, and then passes this array of arguments. Remember, all those things that function expressions might use, we're going to get via parameters. So this isn't exactly immediately invoked, but it is a function expression, and then it's being invoked soon afterward. And it's being passed some variables. This .exports self is actually the current module, so this is essentially module.exports. It gives it the require function. It gives it the module and also that file name and directory name that we saw before, and then runs the function. But the function is actually my code wrapped in this almost immediately invoked function expression. Now I'll step into where it actually invokes the wrapped code, where it invokes the function that my code is now sitting inside of. So I'll step into that, and there we are. It called the function, but my code is the body of the function. So now I'm stepping through my code, the code inside greet.js. And I set module.exports to be a particular value, this greet function. I'll keep going. Now that finished, so it ran my code, and at the end of my code I changed module.exports. And if we keep going, we're backing out, these functions are finishing that had all been called. And here at this point, after I've loaded it and it ran that code, it checks to see if there was any errors, and if it wasn't erroring, here's the line. It's returning module.exports. So the exports property on the module object, the thing that I changed, is being returned back up through the sequence of functions that we called when we called the require function. So module.exports is what's returned after my code is written and processed. So we finish that require function, we finish it, and there. The require function finished running. It went out, got the file, it assumed it was a .js file, loaded the contents, wrapped it, ran it, and then returned whatever came sitting on module.exports, the exports property of the module object. And that turned out to be a function that I then run. And there it is. Hello. Okay, so that was quite a bit. What's really happening here? Let's take another look at what just happened. When I wrote my greet.js file, I have some code. Node runs this. But rather than simply running this code through the V8 engine, it wraps it inside a function expression, using those parentheses to create that function on the fly. And this function expects 5 parameters. You might be wondering what the first one is, exports. We'll ignore that for now. But it also expects a require parameter, a module parameter, a file name, a directory name, and we saw these things being created. So then Node actually invokes the function, passing the things that are expected, the file name, the directory name, the module object, making the require function available to my code because it's passed in reality as a parameter when the code is actually executed. And the same thing with module. Module is available to my code when I'm writing in Node because my code isn't what's actually the only thing that's run. My code is wrapped in a function, and that module is a parameter to that function, and Node passes it in. And the last thing to note is what actually is returned then from require is module.exports. Remember that objects are passed by reference. So whatever I do to module.exports inside my module, because it's inside a function, is going to impact the module.exports that was created outside the function. So require gives me this module object, and then I change the module object by changing what's on .exports. And then that means that when require gives back module.exports, when it returns it from itself as a function, whatever I did inside my module to module.exports, whatever I did inside my module code to this module object, that's what will be returned by require because it's passed by reference, it's pointing at the same object in memory. And so in that way, I'm making available features via module.exports that are protected inside this function. And that's also why the code that I write is protected, because of function scope in JavaScript. My code is actually wrapped in a function, which means the variables that I create, the functions I create inside there, are protected inside that function. They're not available outside. But because of passing by reference, because the module object is passed by reference, I can then use that as my window to outside my function. So I can change the module, and because it's pointing at a memory space that's available outside my function, I can change it, and that change becomes available outside this secretly wrapped function. All right, so this is how this is really working. And remember, it's that module that exports. That's really what's coming back from require. So you need to change module.exports in your code, and that's what's going to be given back from require. So just to quickly summarize, require is a function that you pass a path to. That's all it is. Module.exports is what the require function returns. And this works because your code is actually wrapped in a function expression that is given these things as function parameters. So whenever you're writing code in Node, you have require, you have module, dir name, file name are always available to you, because what you write isn't the only thing that's given to V8. What you write is actually the body of a function. Make sense? So that's how module.exports and require, that's how they actually work. And I wanted to step through some of this code for you, not only to explain how it works, but so that you realize that Node is not some secret, mysterious thing that things are just working inside of. It's just code that other people wrote that you can look at and you can understand. And that will help you in your understanding and how to properly use Node and how to properly use Node modules in this case. And we'll see how understanding this helps us avoid some potential pitfalls and common mistakes. All right, that's require in module.exports in Node.js.